we as explorers and as people who seek freedom from the ego, we tend to be very open-minded and we tend to be very focused on getting ideas. But in this episode, we're going to talk about how ideas can sometimes make us close-minded. Hey, it's Osama, and welcome to episode 5 of Freedom from Ego. So, as you saw in the intro, we're going to be talking about ideas that can radically close your mind instead of opening them up by talking about the inspiration cycle. So, what is the inspiration cycle? Well, the inspiration cycle is basically a thought process of recontextualization. So, let's first talk about why does the mind look for ideas that can recontextualize its reality. Well, as seekers of freedom, we basically tend to have a mindset that whatever I'm believing in has to be real. And so as we live our lives and we go through, our life cycle, we basically have ideas that we believe in, ideas that define our reality, ideas that make things real for us. And so when we are living our lives and we become older, and especially after the dawn of the internet, we have a lot more exposure to information which is contrary to what we used to believe in. And so what happens is that one day you come across an idea that can make you think that the worldview that you have right now is not actually reality. When the ego comes across an idea that tells it that whatever it's believing in is not actual reality, but it could be a facade, what the ego does is to find facts, find ideas which will prove that the worldview it's holding is actually true. And so all the intellectual quest to find basically a solution or some missing link basically results in the ego trying to find and trying to tell itself that the idea that it already believes in is actual reality, because it does not want to believe the fact that whatever it sees right now is not reality. And so the mind basically goes into a thought train of collecting ideas and basically finding facts to solidify the current worldview. And in that quest, when the virus of doubt basically creeps into the mind has a couple questions that arise. So in the quest of the mind trying to basically solidify its reality, it tends to have questions which are interconnected. For example, if we are living in a cave and we've never seen the outside world and we don't believe that the sun exists, if a ray of light shines into our cave, we will think that, okay, the worldview that we have is not accurate. Okay, but the questions connected to it will be, why does the sunlight move? Why does this beam of light move? Why does it come at regular intervals? So why is it so warm? And these are the questions which are interconnected, which arise as a result of having a virus of doubt in the current worldview. And so the inspirational questions basically are interconnected, and it's all connected to just one big question, which will explain all this new phenomena that the mind is seeking to ask as it further divides the world into more smaller chunks and smaller pieces, the recontextualization. Well, so how does the mind basically recontextualize itself when it's actually looking for ways to prove its point, that the worldview that it holds is actually true? Well, the thing is that the inspirational questions are the thing that changes everything. The inspirational questions basically exist as a vacuum inside the mind. And so whenever we are looking for some facts, the mind basically looks for that one big explanation that will answer all these questions. And so it's basically a test fit method. What the mind does is basically goes through ideas that tries to see if it fits. And if it solves all these questions, then the idea recontextualizes everything. If it doesn't, then the mind moves on to something else. Because it's the inspirational questions that basically define if the mind is going to recontextualize or not. Sometimes the mind, in order to be, sometimes the ego can basically find fake, or it can fake its answer to become a lot more at peace. And so the mind basically, with the big question, it searches for answers and compares it to if it answers these inspirational questions. When it comes across an idea that can answer these inspirational questions, the mind suddenly feels a moment of epiphany. That is when we feel like, oh my God, this is how it's all been working out. So if you want to see the examples of this in action, you can go and watch any Christopher Nolan movie, and he'll use this multiple times over. And if you, in the end, feel like, oh my God, I felt, oh, this is how this question was answered, basically the reality is recontextualized, and because he knows this phenomena exists. But that's just a side note. And so using these inspirational questions, the mind basically recontextualizes everything, and the perspective shifts completely. So what does the mind see when it is recontextualized? Well, the mind basically looks at the world completely differently now. Due to its questions being answered now, what the mind does is basically sees the world in the new light, sees the world in a new perspective, sees the limitations of the old perspective, and sees the fact that the world becomes a lot better in a way because the mind can see this new reality. And so what does the mind feel? Well, the mind feels that it has surpassed its old self. The mind feels that the people who are actually believing in the old perspective, the old idea, the facade, are basically in a rat race, and they're following something which is not real, that they're part of some cult, that they're closed-minded, and sees the old authorities, the people who used to preach the ideas that he used to have, as people who are radically more evil or not as good as he used to think. But the dangers of this mentality are in the next section. Well, the dangers of the recontextualization is that because the mind is so happy that it has been recontextualized, because the mind is so happy that it has changed its worldview, it can basically put this idea on a pedestal. And what ends up happening when we put an idea on a pedestal is that we can get attached to it. So attachment is one of the most painful things that can happen to a person seeking freedom from the ego, because freedom from ego implies that we are open-minded, implies that we are not attached to ideas, but ideas help us to become more open-minded, and those ideas help us become more open-minded, and so forth. And so when we are talking about ideas that can become a source of attachment to us, what can happen is that we can become a lot more close to the newer ideas that could come, newer ideas that could actually disprove this new contextualization. And that is one of the most painful things that a mind can have. And so this becomes like one of the most tough things for a person seeking from ego, seeking freedom from ego. And so for freedom, we need to have a couple of things done. So what can be done? Well, when we're talking about setting ourselves apart from attachment, what we are actually doing is basically increasing our intake of great ideas. So if I give you my personal example, when I was a lot younger, these recontextualizations would basically happen over a year. Okay, so in 1 year, I would have a major recontextualization. As I grew older, and obviously my life started to become a lot faster, the recontextualizations happened a lot faster, and I was open to a lot more ideas because of the humility thing that I talked about in the last episode. And so the recontextualization started to get a lot more significant, and the worldviews completely shifted my personality over the course of years. I would have 2 or 3 major recontextualizations. But the thing is that when I would come across a great idea, like an idea which would basically disprove everything that I used to hold as true, what started happening was that after a while, my mind would become basically a lot attached to the idea that I was holding on to, and I would come across times when I would have a very tough time basically opening myself up to newer ideas, better ideas. And so for a while I felt very stuck, and the contextualizations became very slow. And it was because I was attached to a great idea, a really brilliant idea, but attachment, in itself is bad. And so what started happening was that I started feeling quite miserable. And so as quarantine started and we were all locked inside our homes, I started to read a lot more. And in reading, I realized the fact that I was attaching myself to these brilliant ideas because of my intake being super low. And so when I increased my intake of great brilliant ideas, what started happening was that my attachment to these ideas became less and less and less, and my basically criteria for accepting ideas became a lot more fluid, and I became a lot more open-minded. And so I was not as much focused on, is this person, I wasn't as attached to if this person was credible or not, because that's obviously a trap. You should always look at the knowledge in terms of its quality, not the person who's speaking it. I mean, you should take consideration of who's speaking, but sometimes it can come across as a bias in your psyche. And so when I would increase my intake of great ideas, the lessons that I learned from these great ideas became a lot more significant than they used to, because now I'm not worried about if I implement this idea and it doesn't work, I'll somehow be proven wrong, or this recontextualization is false or something like that. And so just by increasing our intake of great brilliant ideas, you can have like a massive shift in your personality, a massive shift in your contextualization, a massive shift in the way you view the world, while at the same time increasing the impact of these great ideas. And so the only thing that I can say is that increase the intake and increase the amount of knowledge that you have, and reduce the attachment that you have. And that is going to radically increase the speed at which you gain freedom from your ego. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.